Now, millions of people across the globe, right this very moment, are being hit by potentially deadly storms. The biggest and most destructive are, of course, Hurricane Florence and Super Typhoon Mangkhut. So are extreme weather events becoming more extreme, and can we say that it is a result of climate change? Well, someone who knows a lot more about this than I, Tom Burke, chairman of the Third Generation Environmentalism and an independent climate change think tank. And Tom, good to see you once again. I mean, it strikes me that there are two parallel questions here. One, whether or not significant, serious weather events like this are becoming more frequent. And secondly, whether or not that has anything to do with climate change. What's your view?
Well, first and foremost, yes, significant events are becoming more frequent, and you can see that in the records that they are happening more. Extreme events are happening more often than they used to happen. But now we're beginning to be able to read the climate signal, so the bit that we can attribute specifically to climate change. So on Florence, for instance, the scientists are now saying about 50% more rainfall will occur on Florence than would otherwise have been the case if we hadn't had a change in climate.
So what is the cause then? What is climate? What is the effect that climate change is having on the way in which these storms form that's turning them into these more powerful beasts?
Well, the two things that really matter are the sea surface temperature, which creates more energy to be sucked up by the hurricane, and then climate change makes for more water to evaporate from the surface of the earth, so you have more moisture in the air, so you combine a more powerful hurricane because it's drawing more heat up from the ocean with more moisture in the air, and you get exactly the kind of event we saw last year in Houston, with massive rainfall, and as we're going to see, we're in the middle of seeing now, happening in Florence. So you get massive amounts of flooding. And that means that on top of the damage from wind, which we kind of understand and know about, we're now seeing that you're getting even more damage from floods coming, because again, as you're saying in Florence, you're getting the hurricane coming in on top of what's already been quite wet soil.
I suppose the climate skeptics would suggest that we just don't have the data set yet to be able to establish the link between climate change and these significant weather events, which we've clearly, anecdotally, all of us know that we've seen an increase in their numbers, but whether or not we've got sufficient decades worth of data to make that assessment.
I think that's a view that's about 10 to 15 years out of date. I think what we've seen very clearly now is the way in which you can begin to attribute the climate component of an extreme weather event. Now, extreme weather events have multiple causes. Nobody's saying climate change causes Florence, but what proportion of the actual impact of Florence is because of the temperature rise from climate change, then we can begin to see that. It's the science of what's called climate attribution, and that's got very much more sophisticated in the last 10 years in particular. And indeed, now that's coming to the point where not only can we check back after an event's happened and see how much of that's climate change, well, we're on the verge of being able to forecast how much of an extreme weather event would have been caused by climate change.
Well, given the change, and obviously we're looking at pictures at the moment where we can see this huge storm surge that's coming in. You know, the meteorologists were assessing perhaps as much as 9 feet in places. Yeah. It's absolutely huge. I mean, what evidence is there as the global policymakers are taking this seriously enough?
I think they're definitely not taking it seriously enough. They're taking it more seriously than they were taking it, and that was why Paris was such an important moment. But what's quite clear from the science, the whole of climate science, is that what we're doing is changing the climate faster, and in ways that are nastier than we previously thought. And that means we've got to get more ambition out of the politicians to do what we know how to do. That's the real issue here. We know what we've got to do. We've got to stop burning fossil fuels. It's very straightforward.
I mean, you mentioned Paris a moment ago. I mean, all of this is happening on Donald Trump's doorstep. I mean, without the United States involved, what hope for that faster, more radical public policy thinking?
Well, I think you're going to discover that the United States government is rather less important than Donald Trump thought in dealing with this problem. First of all, there's a meeting going on right now in San Francisco in which Jerry Brown, other leaders from around the states and cities are calling a global summit to say we're going to stick to Paris in America. So his own country doesn't go along with him on that. But meanwhile, much more importantly, in a way, the financial community is beginning to get the message. We've seen Larry Fink, the head of the biggest asset manager, saying, look, climate risk is for real. We've seen central bankers like Mark Carney saying this is a problem that we've really got to take seriously. That's going to have a real impact.
So sorry to get something vaguely parochial here just for a moment and bring it back to the United Kingdom. And you're speaking as someone who occasionally looks at these extreme weather events and say, well, look, that actually looks like many of the summers that I experienced when I was younger. I mean, what are the chances that here in the United Kingdom there will be a direct impact upon us from events similar to those we've been seeing?
Think of climate change as a disease like diabetes. If you don't do something about it, it gets progressively worse. So if we act in time, we'll still be suffering for a very long time from the effects of climate change. If we don't act faster than we are now acting, then we will start to see in Britain summers like the one we've just had be every second summer or so on. So I think a real impact on our lives directly, as well, of course, the impact around the rest of the world will affect our ability to maintain a prosperous and secure country.
How do you get, though, those developing nations for whom a reliance on fossil fuels, their reliance is perhaps greater, that they don't have the technological expertise, they don't have access to the technology, the green technologies that we might have here?
Well, in a sense, what really matters for most of those developing nations is that we change and use the technology here. We account for most in the developed world for most of the emissions, and if we don't burn the fossil fuels, then there isn't a market for them. I think it's much more important to think about somewhere like China. People often raise that question, are they really going to do what they say? Well, the thing to remember is when they agree things internationally, it's because they think it's in their interest, not because they think it's in our interest. We haven't got a gun to put at their head. They're doing things because they've seen, and in fact China is one of the most vulnerable countries of rich economies to a changing climate. They do things because it's in their interest, and that's what Paris really meant.
Indeed. Tom Burke, always good to see you. Thanks for coming in.
At all. Pleasure.